Back in 1935, during the debate over the passage of the Social Security Act, certain people in the Congress, who were members of a long extinct species of creature called fiscal conservatives, of which no specimens have been observed in the wild for some decades now, thought the Social Security Act was an extraordinarily bad idea. And to be fair, the fiscal conservative argument wasn't the only argument against passing that legislation. There was another school of thought, and its rationale was much simpler. This is bad because it's socialism. And besides, our national government is not set up in such a way that permits that sort of top-down federal transactional entitlement scheme to function effectively. It's arguable whether Article 2 of the Constitution permits us to do such things even if we wanted to. And those arguments have nothing to do with any qualitative value judgment about whether government-administered old age pension schemes are or are not a good idea in general. Rather, they are arguments about what kind of powers are actually delegated to the legislature by the National Charter. That is to say, you can be against the Social Security Act, and it doesn't automatically mean you want Grandpa and Grandma to starve to death while living in the street. And in an age when everyone seems to argue everything all the time based on the lowest common denominator spurious appeal to emotion, I think it's important that we stop and point that out from time to time. But it was the fiscal conservative argument rather than the utilitarian constitutionalist argument that had more currency both in the public and in the Congress. And that one was only slightly more complicated. We can't do this, the argument went, because the arithmetic says this program will bankrupt the entire national economy in under 100 years. Sure, we might be able to make it look like it's sustainable for 20 or 50 or even 75 years, but we'll still just be kicking the can down the road. And the day of reckoning will inevitably arrive when the entire American project is groaning under the prodigious weight of this one single entitlement program. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the world they were trying to warn you about. Today, in the year 2023, Social Security expenditures account for a staggering 18% of gross national product. According to the official projection by the Congressional Budget Office, the Social Security Trust Fund is going to be fully 100% depleted by 2034. So if you're the same age as me, that's 5 years before you turn 65. Oh, and that 18% of GNP, that doesn't count the portion of the trust fund that they get to dip into to service the interest on the national debt. Because Congress decided that would be a lovely idea around 25 years ago. But that's what tends to happen when you pass a piece of legislation and establish a big, giant, gleaming new federal bureaucracy and you leave it in place for 90 years or so, and people keep attaching new things to it, like barnacles on the hull of a sailing ship. Except these barnacles never get scraped off. These barnacles become part of the structural framework of the vessel. And you look up one day, and you find there are dozens and dozens of different entitlement programs, all being federally administered under the aegis of the Social Security Act. Now, according to that very same CBO projection, there are 4 ways in which that eventuality, the total depletion of the Social Security Fund, 11 years from today, how that could potentially be forestalled. The first would be a drastic reduction in the average lifespan. And I think Tony Fauci has been hard at work on that one. The second is a massive cut in benefits. The third is a drastic increase in the Social Security payroll deduction, which currently stands at 12.5%. And the fourth is a dramatic increase in individual productivity. And if you have ever met a millennial, I think you'll understand why nobody should be holding their breath waiting for that one to materialize. Now, realistically, and let's face it, there's nothing realistic about any of this. It would take a highly improbable, totally unlikely confluence of all 4 of those things happening before I would be willing to contemplate the possibility of ever seeing a Social Security benefit check with my name on it. I have been in the workforce for 35 years now, and I have never for one moment operated under the illusion that I will see 1 dime of Social Security when I turn 65. But you know what? All that money I've had withheld from every paycheck I have ever earned, I would gladly trade every penny of it in return for living in a country whose economy isn't being crushed under the weight of a 90-something-year-old piece of legislation that was always doomed to collapse in on itself like a dying star. And I think, frankly, more people need to come around to that realization. As it is, every generation of Americans seems to say, well, yeah, sure, I know Social Security is unsustainable, and I do really think they should get rid of it, just as soon as I finish collecting my benefits. Now, Kevin McCarthy, he's had a pretty encouraging start as the House Speaker. But you know how you can tell it's still going to be business as usual in Washington? The fact that McCarthy wanted to make super duper extra sure the Democrats didn't think he was going to request any cuts to Social Security or Medicare in the upcoming budget negotiations. Should there be public old age pension schemes for working Americans? Sure. And they can be most effectively administered at the state level, just like most other things can. The federal government, they can make a minimum set of standards, and that's where their involvement should end. And now that all of our over 65 viewers are furiously unsubscribing from the channel, Jim Eagle, hit that funky music. From atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where, no, I haven't seen any interesting police body cam footage today, have you? I don't know what you're talking about. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. Happy Friday. I'm your eponymous host and humble servant. I got a treat for you. We're going to play a fun party game tonight. I am going to read selected excerpts from a certain speech given by a certain man in a certain year in a certain place. And after each excerpt, you have to guess the man and the year. Each time you guess incorrectly, you have to remove an article of clothing. If you run out of clothes because, let's say you're only wearing a bustier and a lacy thong, well, then you have to take a shot instead. But I don't expect that many of you will be naked and drunk at the end of this thing. I mean, unless you're naked and drunk for reasons that have nothing to do with me. Since we have the most erudite, most historically literate audience on the entire interwebs, so I imagine that most of you will have it nailed down fairly early on. But we're going to play just the same. And look, I know we are on the honor system here, but I trust I can rely on you all to police yourselves and abide by the rules like the good, decent, upstanding people you are. I would be extremely disappointed if there were rumors of shenanigans and I had to demand boob pictures, is all I'm saying. And with that, let's begin. And bear in mind also, as you're listening to these, how many of them are totally 100% pertinent and relevant in the present day. Excerpt number 1, quote, "Neither the defense nor the development of other nations can be exclusively or primarily an American undertaking. The nations of each part of the world should assume the primary responsibility for their own well-being, and they themselves should determine the terms of that well-being. We shall be faithful to our treaty commitments, but we shall reduce our involvement and our presence in other nations' affairs. To insist that other nations play a role is not a retreat from responsibility, it is a sharing of responsibility." End quote. Excerpt number 2, quote, "First, we cannot delay longer in accomplishing a total reform of our welfare system. When a system penalizes work, breaks up homes, robs recipients of dignity, there is no alternative to abolishing that system and adopting in its place the program of income support, job training, and work incentives. Second, the time has come to assess and reform all of our institutions of government at the federal, state, and local level. It is a time for a new federalism in which, after 190 years of power flowing from the people and local and state governments to Washington, D.C., it will begin to flow from Washington back to the states and to the people of the United States." End quote. Excerpt number 3, quote, "We must adopt reforms which will expand the range of opportunities for all Americans. We can fulfill the American dream only when each person has a fair chance to fulfill his own dreams. This means equal voting rights, equal employment opportunity, and new opportunities for expanded ownership. Because in order to be secure in their human rights, people need access to property rights. I could give similar examples of the need for reform in our programs for health, education, housing, transportation, as well as other critical areas which directly affect the well-being of millions of Americans. The people of the United States should wait no longer for these reforms that would so deeply enhance their quality of life. End quote. Excerpt number 4. Quote, now millions of Americans are forced to go into debt today because the federal government decided to go into debt yesterday. We must balance our federal budget so that American families will have a better chance to balance their family budgets. Only with the cooperation of the Congress can we meet this highest priority objective of reasonable government. End quote. Excerpt 5. Quote, I can assure you that not only to present, but to stay within a balanced budget requires some very hard decisions. It means rejecting spending programs which would benefit some of the people when their net effect would result in price increases for all the people. It is time to quit putting good money into bad programs. Otherwise, we will end up with bad money and bad programs. I recognize the political popularity of spending programs, and particularly in an election year. But unless we stop the rise in prices, the cost of living for millions of American families will become unbearable, and government's ability to plan programs for progress for the future will become impossible. End quote. Excerpt number 6. Quote, we have heard a great deal of overblown rhetoric in which the word war has perhaps too often been used. The war on poverty, the war on misery, the war on disease, the war on hunger. But if there is one area where the word war is appropriate, it is in the fight against crime. We must declare and win the war against the criminal elements which increasingly threaten our cities, our homes, and our lives. We have a tragic example of this problem in the nation's capital, for whose safety the Congress and the executive have the primary responsibility. I doubt if many members of this Congress who live more than a few blocks from here would dare leave their cars in the Capitol garage and walk home alone tonight. End quote. Excerpt number 7. Quote, the great question before us is, shall we surrender to our surroundings, or shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water? Restoring nature to its natural state is a cause beyond party and beyond factions. It has become a common cause of all the people of this country. It is a cause of particular concern to young Americans, because they, more than we, will reap the grim consequences of our failure to act on programs which are now needed if we are to prevent disaster later. Clean air, clean water, open spaces, these should once again be the birthright of every American. If we act now, they can be. We still think of air as free, but clean air is not free, and neither is clean water. The price tag on pollution control is high. Through our years of past carelessness, we incurred a debt to nature, and now that debt is being called. End quote. Excerpt number 8. Quote, the automobile is our worst polluter of the air. Adequate control requires further advances in engine design and fuel composition. We shall intensify our research, set increasingly strict standards, and strengthen enforcement procedures, and we shall do it now. End quote. Excerpt number 9. Quote, we can no longer afford to consider air and water common property, free to be abused by anyone without regard to the consequences. Instead, we should begin now to treat them as scarce resources, which we are no more free to contaminate than we are free to throw garbage into our neighbor's yard. Now, I realize that the argument is often made that there is a fundamental contradiction between economic growth and the quality of life, so that to have one we must forsake the other. The answer is not to abandon growth, but to redirect it. For example, we should turn toward ending congestion and eliminating smog, the same reservoir of inventive genius that created them in the first place. End quote. Excerpt number 10. Quote, we have been too tolerant of our surroundings and too willing to leave it to others to clean up our environment. It is time for those who make massive demands on society to make some minimal demands on themselves. Each of us must resolve that each day he will leave his home, his property, the public spaces of the city or town a little cleaner, a little better, a little more pleasant for himself and those around him. The violent and decayed central cities of our great metropolitan complexes are the most conspicuous area of failure in American life today. End quote. President Richard Milhous Nixon, Washington, D.C., 22 January 1970. His first State of the Union address. And you hear a lot of things in that speech, I'm sure you'll agree, that sound like they could have come from the mouth of Donald Trump during his first State of the Union address in 2018. Because there were some pretty explicit shots across the bow of the entrenched bureaucratic interests in Washington, the same sorts of people we refer to today in our current parlance as the deep state. This is a president saying to the administrative state, you guys have had a cushy free ride for far too long, and it's coming to an end, and your days are numbered. You've been enriching and empowering yourselves on the backs of the American people for too long, and I see you, and I'm coming for you. So is it any great mystery why the same people who came after Nixon and drove him from office came after Trump and drove him from office 46 years later? We love to tell ourselves that we're living in unprecedented times, but we never are. There is nothing new under the sun or in American politics. It is different people in different eras doing all the exact same shit over again. Well, except for Joe Biden. He's been there the entire time. Ever since he first enlisted in the Delaware militia when the War of 1812 broke out, where he wound up serving with distinction in the Corn Pop Regiment. And I'll tell you something else about that war. The next time you get accosted by some uppity Canadian who tries to take credit for the torching of the White House, I would encourage you to politely acquaint that poutine-eating freak with the real historical record and explain that actually what happened that night was that Hunter Biden, he accidentally burned down the executive mansion when he tried to light his crack pipe off of the kitchen brazier. The damn Canadians didn't arrive until 6 hours later to find the place already a smoldering ruin, while Hunter made his escape on a stolen horse, only to be apprehended the next morning at a house of ill repute on the Maryland border. But as bad as things were for Hunter at that point, he sure did do a splendid job of turning his life around. Today, he's revered not only as America's greatest naval hero, but as a groundbreaking pioneer in the school of American mid-century impressionist finger painting. Who can forget that momentous day when his most famous and influential work, the transcendent Thing I Did with Glitter After Banging Some Stripper, went up for auctions at Christie's and proceeded to smash, likely for all time and eternity, the record in the category of biggest price paid in a brazenly transparent money laundering scheme for an artwork that makes the average motel room painting look by comparison like Rubens knocked up Monet and they had a baby named Caravaggio. And again, not to belabor the point, but can we please stop with these wild theories that there's something nefarious going on with the Penn Biden Center for China Pays My Mortgage and I Love It? Because it seems perfectly normal and plausible to this commentator that this is a totally on-the-level enterprise dedicated to impregnating the earth with Joe Biden's boundless wisdom in much the same way that Admiral Hunter Biden, America's greatest fighting sailor and artistic prodigy, impregnates random pole dancers on a Saturday night. Thank you very much indeed for watching. I hope this episode has been as edifying for you as it was for me and Jim Eagle. I hope you have learned a thing or two about American history along the way. I hope you have the most pleasant weekend imaginable. And finally, I hope you get off my lawn.